everyone. Good morning and welcome to our fourth annual American Language Program Winter Conference at Columbia University. We are really happy that you have given up your Saturday to come and learn with us. We have people here from schools all over the city and the local area. We also have people from Teachers College. We'd also like to extend a special welcome to the foreign language lecturers and senior lecturers from Columbia University as well. So welcome to all of you. We're very proud of this little conference. It's grown from modest beginnings, but we've really tried to keep its essence the same, which is small. So after the plenary, you only have to choose between two presentations. And cheap, because let's face it, we are language teachers, not hedge fund managers. And also we do this because we're very passionate about professional development. It's a cornerstone of our program, and so this is a way for us to pay it forward to the community. So, it is my job to introduce our plenary speaker, Dr. Frances Boyd. Frances has been a full-time faculty member here at the American Language Program for over 30 years. She's a senior lecturer and has also held a number of administrative positions in our program. She's developed and taught classes across all levels of our program. She's worked with business students in the summer. She's worked with the International Teaching Fellows Program, just all across the board. Frances has also been instrumental in expanding our extensive reading expanding extensive reading in our program, creating frameworks for news groups and book groups where students regularly read outside of class and then come in and share what they've been reading. Frances has also been an important mentor to new ALP faculty. She's always willing to pass her knowledge and expertise on to the next generation of instructors in our program. But this willingness to pass it on is not just limited to the ALP. She's very active in the field of English language teaching. She has been, or still is, I'm not sure which, on the editorial board of MEX TESOL Journal. Still, yeah. She is a regular speaker at the ANUPI conference in Mexico, including 2 papers presented just last October. She has regularly also presented at TESOL and will be doing so in March in Chicago and also at New York State TESOL as well. She has an article coming out on news groups later this year in the 2nd edition of New Ways of Teaching Speaking. And perhaps she is best known to many of you as the co-series editor, along with our very own Carol Numrich, of North Star, which is now in production for its 5th edition. So, with all that in mind, Frances had to take all these years of experience and come up with a 1.5-hour plenary talk on vocabulary, which is an enormous topic, and it informs all aspects of her work and her outlook to teaching. I imagine it's been a tricky task to distill it down. But she has done so, and so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Frances Boyd to the podium.
Thank you, Mary Pickett. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I want to thank Christopher and my colleague Brittany for this conference, beautifully organized conference. And I actually want to thank all of my colleagues, past and present, because without them, I would be nowhere. So thank you so much, all of you. I want to welcome all word lovers, all word nerds. You're in your home here. People who love and really think seriously about teaching and learning vocabulary have said that words and lexical phrases are the fabric of language. The building blocks of what we use to communicate. And it's also been said that language is the most human thing about being human. Perhaps we could also say that vocabulary is the most language-like thing about language. So as Mary just mentioned, vocabulary and language is everywhere, like a through line through everything we do. Speaking, listening, reading, writing, grammar, it's all there. So I began thinking, could it be helpful perhaps to think of an approach to teaching vocabulary, a kind of framework, a consistent framework that could guide us in our efforts. And I came up with these 4 practices that kind of coalesce into sort of an approach. It's research-based, they're interactive, and they really aim to pinpoint some of the teacher skills and student skills that one needs. So in this talk, I hope I might remind you of something you've forgotten. Perhaps I'll inform you of something. And best of all, I hope to spur you to some small change that will reinvigorate your practice. Let's just do a quick survey. How many are teaching K through 12 English? Okay. And how about college and university and adult programs? Lots of people. And how about languages other than English? Great. Well, welcome to everybody. So let's get started. This painting is by Andrew Wyeth, and the analogy is by Corey Stamper, one who defines words for a living as a lexicographer. And she's also written a delightful book called Word by Word. Maybe some of you know it. What does her analogy suggest to you? Think of English as a river. Always changing, never ending. Words flowing. So it's all these currents of different kinds of English, very flexible and fluid. And I think there's probably mud on the bottom, some discarded words too. So language is dynamic. And the research that's gone on recently is very dynamic. Paul Nation, who is the guru of vocabulary study from the University of Wellington in New Zealand, says over 30% of the research on vocabulary that has appeared in the last 110 years was published in the last 11. He said that in 2013. So it's quite extraordinary. And John Reed had said, once a backwater, vocabulary is now a booming area of linguistic research and language teaching. So why? Well, we can easily guess. There are hordes of learners all over the world. There's a lot of business interest in artificial intelligence and machine kind of language. And of course, it's the new tools. We have these computers that count and search and slice and dice and do marvelous things for us on one level. So by the mid-1980s, the field of corpus linguistics was born. And scholars began mining the corpora. And one definition of a corpus is a curated collection of full-text sources that's dumped into a searchable database. By the late 1990s, they yielded up some gems for us language teachers. One of them is the academic word list. Another are multi-word units and lexicalized grammar. So I'm going to talk about a few of these. First thing is computers are really good at counting. So these frequency studies have given us new insights into the lexicon. So notice that we have high-frequency words in English. Actually, West General Service Listee did way before computers, but it has remained quite stable. And the first 2,000 words, these short little words, are the most common. In fact, that's fine. So then the shorter the word, the more common it is. And then we have the academic word list, which is common words in academic texts. Then we have more, like 9,000 mid-frequency words. So these are general purpose words and also subject-specific words. So if I see frontline casualties and ammunition, I think, okay, military or something related. And then there are hordes, thousands upon thousands of low-frequency words, all the proper names and all the other words, like Ohio and Carl and plummet and ploy. So in fact, the 100 most frequent words in English account for 50% of the words in a typical text. Think of that. So English has loads of words overall, In fact, English might be the only language that has a dictionary-sized thesaurus. There are many more words than we can possibly ever teach explicitly. So those frequency studies have been very important. The academic word list, that's words like argue, accumulate, analyze, evaluate. And it was actually the MA thesis of Averill Coxhead, now a professor at the university in New Zealand also. So it has 570 word families in 10 sublists. And a word family is, if you take the word analyze, for example, the word forms: analysis, analyze, analytical, analytically. And then if you go back to the verb, all the verb forms, all the verb moods and modes and everything. And she identified from 3.5 million words of running text, written academic text, the 570 most common. Shall I continue? So if you take that West's list from 1953 and you add it to the academic word list, you get 90% coverage of academic texts. The interesting thing about here is that these words are common in academic texts, but not so common in other texts. And they're less well known than subject-specific words. So we often get students who know their subject words, but they don't know these words. The other good thing about these words is that English teachers can help with them because we know these words, whereas we may not know the subject-specific words. So that's what context-independent means. You can take a word like analyze, and you can do it in any subject. At the same time, there's some downsides to that because they're polysyllabic, highfalutin kind of words. And 82% of them are of Latin and Greek origin. So if you're a speaker of a language that's not of Latin or Greek origin, you don't have that advantage. So you need to keep that in mind when you're working with the academic word list. These miners of the great corpora have come up with multi-word units. This is currently what I find the most common name for these. These are high frequency too, 20 to 50% of natural language. They're especially common in listening and speaking. They're strings of words that stick together and obey what we call the principle of collocation. So they co-locate, they stick together. Some stick very closely. Perhaps we use the analogy of family, like mother and son or husband and wife. You hope, anyway. They stick closely together. But some are a little more distant. You might think of them as cousins or so. But what's also important is they're stored in the memory as single units. So when you go into your head, you don't have to take each word. You just take the unit. So I call them word-like objects. And they're really essential for fluency. Paul Nation, the guru again, says the nature of language use necessitates collocational knowledge. And you know, phrasal verbs, we know, look up to. Phrasal verbs can be seen as lexis, as vocabulary. Delexicalized verbs, like put up with, are an interesting class of multi-word units because the put doesn't really have that much meaning. So you could say put up, put out, put down, put forth, but the put is not where the meaning is. The meaning is in the particle with it. And there are a bunch of verbs like this in English, like do and get and have and keep, make and take. And idioms, we all love idioms. In the wake of is apparently the most common, but then you get more colorful ones like lose your train of thought. Another kind of multi-word unit is the lexical phrase, salt and pepper. These are fixed phrases and they contain a concept usually, do's and don'ts. I was recently in Mexico and I saw a sign that said, Pepe's Grill and Bar. No. No. So collocations are fixed in these things. So collocations are things like thick accent, in this case, accent doesn't have to be thick. It could be thick, it could be strong, it could be slight, it could be southern. All of those are collocations for accent. But also it's important that you look at the collocation patterns. So in English, adjective plus noun is a really common one. To get a sense of these multi-word phrases, it's helpful to peruse the lists and keep them handy. I wouldn't just teach from the list, but on my handout I have the names of some of the big ones like Martinez and the Coca list and the My Case list. And it's useful just to take a look at them. Another kind of pattern is patterns of metaphor. Now this was actually a pre-computer find too, but I find it so fascinating and culturally revealing. Johnson and Lakoff in 1980 wrote a book called Metaphors We Live By. And we can see that time and money are connected in our vocabulary as well as our culture. We spend money, we spend time. We waste money, we waste time. So what about arguments in English? Think for a moment. We construct them, we buttress them, we build them, but sometimes they collapse and they fall apart. So what's the underlying metaphor? Arguments are like buildings. And that could be an interesting insight for academic writers. Corpus linguistics is altering perceptions of all languages, and high-frequency categories are being identified, but they're not always the same. So if we take cognates in Romance languages, we all know about cognates, but they're patterns of cognates, and we can count which are the most common. So there's similar words across language in spelling, meaning, and sometimes pronunciation. So recognizing them can create a bridge for the learner. And it's a very high-frequency phenomenon in Spanish. So if you have a bunch of English speakers learning Spanish, or the opposite, it's a very handy thing. I've also read that Korean university students know about 9,000 words that have been adopted into Korean from English. Now, the pronunciation might be a little funky, but, but they know more than we think. And Japanese students may know about 1,500. I recently saw this sign in Mexico. And I thought, I know these vets. It's a brother-sister team. They're almost bilingual. Why are they making such a basic mistake? Of course, the joke was on me, because these are cognates, hospital, animal. They're both cognates, but what's happening here is the cognate pattern is totally different. So I had to laugh at myself. And then when they translated, they didn't bother using the cognates at all. Lexicalized grammar is another thing that's, there's a lot of research in this area of multi-word units, and lexicalized grammar kind of fascinates me. It's the idea that there's a blur between grammar and lexis. So these phrases occur frequently also. The interesting thing is they can be taught as unanalyzed word-like objects. So I've taught on an intermediate level, which is kind of a B 1.1 level, what I like is. Now, when you're dealing with intermediate students, you're not going to go into, oh, it's a noun clause, it's in subject position, blah, blah, blah. No, you just say, when you want to express a preference, here's a way to do it. Learn it like vocabulary. And you can do the same thing with if I were you, I'd. It's a string of words. It's like a multi-word unit. Just learn it like vocabulary. Whew, it relieves you from all that, you know, oh, it's got to be were, or it should be were, and all that grammar. So in sum, corpus linguistics has, in the past 30 years, has given us a new view of words and word patterns. And I'm reminded of a wonderful analogy. Some of you know a professor here named Stephen Green, theoretical physicist, and he does string theory. And to explain string theory, he said, you know, the world is not made of grape nuts, chunks, right? The world is made of Cheerios. And so I would say to you, the language is not made of grape nuts, it's made of grape nuts and Cheerios. So it helps us figure out what kind of words we want to spend time on. We've also learned a few things about the learners. And I just want to mention things that I think are important for learning vocabulary. This vocabulary size, the learning burden, knowing a word, learning a word, and remembering a word. How many words do students know in the second language, and how many do they need to know? There's a lot of research on this. One common number I've heard is an educated native speaker, adult native speaker, might have 20,000 words. My level 6, which is a B point 1.2, is that right? 1.2? More or less. I gave them a 3,000 test. And they did well on it, so they clearly have more than 3,000. My level 7, which is a B 2.2 on the European scale, I gave them a 5,000 word thing, and they did pretty well. But the ones who didn't do very well got a message that they really are deficient in vocabulary. So I don't use it to scare them, although Brittany said I did scare somebody, 20,000. But to motivate them, you know, there's a gap, and you need to try to fill it in. So Nation on his website, which I put on my handout, has tests in many different languages, and it can be kind of fun just to try it. They're short, like 10 items or so. Another concept is the learning burden. Just how hard is any given word or multi-word unit for a student? The amount of effort does it require? So first think about the learner. What's their first language? What's their proficiency level? It turns out that the more words you know, the easier it is to learn other words. What's their educational level? My sister-in-law is teaching Mexican mechanics. Very little education. It's so difficult for them. But she's getting very good at tools. Their study habits, their motivation, all those things about the learner. But it's also about the word or the multi-word unit. Is it long or short? Is it hard to pronounce or easy? How about the spelling? Is the spelling obvious or is it weird? Is it a new concept or a known concept? So to go back to the Koreans, it turns out that all the Korean students know what I would consider a $25 word, ubiquitous. Have you discovered this? They all know it. And I said, but why? So I spoke to one of my students. He said, well, there was this pre-smartphone device that let parents figure out where their students were, where their kids were, called ubiquitous. So you never know, right? And then I have my problems, learning burden. There's a professor here who always uses the word interstices. Interstices. Okay, I kind of get it. He's a sociologist, Jonathan Cole. But it's not a word, I mean, I really don't want to use that word. Maybe I'm not a sociologist, but it's weird. And he says it all the time. I think maybe he sees the world like interstices or something. The other word is inchoate. Inchoate. You love it, okay. To me, like, maybe because of what it means, only partly formed, like I can't get my brain around it, but those are my heavy learning burden words. So knowing a word, you ask students, do you know it? And they say, well, yeah. And they'll give you a definition or a synonym. But actually, it includes a whole lot more. Form, that means the word forms, the pronunciation, the sound of it, and the spelling of it. Meaning, the synonyms, the definition, or polysemy, when it has several possible definitions. I love to tease my advanced students who think they know everything with a new meaning of a simple word like water. Water, yeah, it could be a verb. Water your plants, or whatever. And then usage, collocation. What words does it collocate? Does it usually appear with? Connotations. Register. So many things to learn. So it moves along a continuum. You start with the unknown, the partially known, and we hang out for a long time in the partially known, and then eventually the known. So it's an incremental process, and it's a tall order. Calfee and Drum gave this description of knowing a word. It involves depth of meaning, precision of meaning, facile access. Think of Scrabble and crossword experts. How many do we have here? Scrabble and crossword experts. Come on, you word nerds. Yeah, I know. The ability to articulate one's understanding. flexibility in the application of knowledge of a word, the appreciation of metaphor, analogy, wordplay, the ability to recognize a synonym, to define, to use a word expressively. That's a tall order. So students have to know it's more than just definition, or definition in Chinese. That's what I get. Okay. Learning a word. Nation says this is a process. First you notice it. In a way, you decontextualize it and just look at it. Then retrieve. We spend a long time in retrieve. He says at least 12 exposures. Observe how it's used, how it functions, what form it takes. And finally, use or create with that word. So hold this thought, because this will be important when we talk about the classroom. What about remembering? Paul Pimsleur, years ago, did some research on the forgetting chart. It turns out what you learn, you forget really quickly. But then if you review it, it takes you a little longer. And if you review it again, it takes you a little longer. That's called spaced retrieval. So we have retrieval, and then we have spaced retrieval. So the solution to this is frequent, short practice with words. And not just all at once, all on one day. What's called massed practice. Then there's the Velcro theory of memory. So I could talk to you, or I could try to talk to you about the amygdala, the hippocampus, and all of these nice mid-frequency technical words for neuroscience. But Chip and Dan Heath have made neuroscience simple. Memory is like Velcro in their principles of sticky ideas. So things that stick in the memory are simple, unexpected, concrete, like images, and linked to stories. So I have a very funny student in our class right now. And he said, Frances, you know the word ogre? I said, yeah. He said, you know how you remember it? O-G-R-E. Brilliant, right? We're never going to forget it. In Frances Jensen's book, The Teenage Brain, she points out that teenagers make really good memories, quicker and better than adults, but they haven't developed judgment. So they're not so good at long-term planning and other things that we have on them. So don't despair. Available lexicon. Let's try an experiment. Take out a piece of paper or on your laptop, whatever. I'm going to give you a category, and I'm going to ask you to write down as many words as you can in 1 minute. Oh, where's my clock? Are you ready? Okay, in your mother tongue, whatever it is, you decide. If you're bilingual, how lucky. Use both. You're writing down all the words and expressions that come to your mind when I say this category. Ready? Ready? Animals. Stop. So take a look at your list. Is it long, pretty long? Yeah. Talk to somebody next to you. Just compare lists. How many have you got? Okay. Okay, so, well, I guess you enjoyed that. That is your available lexicon, your productive lexicon. So remember, you can study and remember and work all you want, but what do you have at your fingertips to actually use? That is different. That's your available lexicon. And it's the vocabulary you're fluent with. If we had more time, we'd do your second language, but we'll save that for another day. All right, so there's been incredible amount of research on the lexicon and on the learners. So how can we use these insights in our own teaching and learning of vocabulary? I'm a teacher, so I think, okay, how can I help them? What can I do? And I've made a few assumptions here. I've made an assumption that we're using a textbook. I never thought I would say that, but I am saying it. Of course, we have other materials with which we supplement it, but most of us are now using textbooks, and it's content-based. Yes? Okay. Most of these have noticed vocabulary, but do very little else. They think, I guess, students will pick it up. It's true, students do pick up vocabulary, but at a very slow pace. So we have to think a little bit more about what we can do. This is to help them ply the waters of English, of that river. So let's look at what Paul Nation has put forth. He said a balanced vocabulary development program has 4 strands. And this idea is very widely disseminated and accepted. It's a very important contribution to second language education, in my view, and in that of many others. Meaning-focused input, listening, reading, content-based with meaning. Meaning-focused output, speaking, writing. Explicit instruction, some time when we're really talking about how vocabulary works, what kinds there are, etc. And fluency development. This is an interesting category because this is using the language you already know, but using it more naturally. I think I'm a little remiss in that department. I'm always pushing. You know, maybe we need to have some time to develop fluency with what we have, our available lexicon. His point is that your program ought to have 25% of each. This is very helpful, I think, to think about. To add to the academic conversation about teaching and learning vocabulary, I want to talk in slightly more finer grained terms about what happens in the classroom. So I'm starting from a textbook. I'm a little bit more focused on English. And I'm very much focused on learner autonomy and collaboration. I'm convinced that vocabulary learning and all kinds of learning requires this partnership between the teacher and the students with each other. So here is the heart of the matter, the whole enchilada. You can think of your approach to vocabulary development in terms of 4 good practices. Target words is Zimmerman's word for teacher-selected words. Strategies are word learning skills for students. Teachable moments are specific classroom skills and techniques to promote vocabulary learning and awareness. And learning our autonomy and collaboration are some specific activities to promote this. The practices reinforce one another, and they clearly distinguish 3 groups of vocabulary. First is the teacher-selected, then the student-selected, and thirdly, the incidental, that which comes up during the class. So imagine you're teaching a unit on longevity, high intermediate, which is a B 2.1 on the European framework. And you have 2 listenings. One is on longevity myths and facts, and one is a first-person account of a woman who changed her career and decided for her encore career to teach computing to people over 65. So I'm just going to illustrate some activities with reference to that that theme, that content. The first practice, target words, the point here is to critically examine this book that you're using for the number and the type of words selected by the authors or publishers for the students to notice. The second is to replicate the process of learning a word in activities throughout the course. So a lot of that retrieve and some of the use create activities. So that's practice number one. Practice, and when you look at your materials critically, how are they selected? Is it just frequency and range? Is it just the common words they've selected? Or how about words for comprehending this particular text? How about words that are of interest to students? Academic or personal interests. I have 3 lawyers in my class. Well, they want to know sue, plea, indict, acquit, guilty. They want to know that. And what about words that are just interesting in themselves? We were talking about medical mysteries this week, and the word quarantine came up. It turns out that quarantine, maybe some of you know this wonderful story, comes from the days of the Black Plague in Venice, and the boats would come up, and they had to stay out there for 40 giorni, except it was said in a Viennese dialect. They had to stay offshore for 40 days. So wow, that's kind of a cool thing to know about a word. And then what about words and multi-word units? Are we seeing those Cheerios? Are we seeing those strings in the selection of items? The collocation patterns, the idioms, and all those things. So be critical about what the book is offering you or your materials. So this is just a selection of things you can do that are quick. You have many other ideas, I'm sure. You can sort by current knowledge. So if you give them a long list of words, I usually try for 25 or so at the high, intermediate, and advanced, and just say, okay, we haven't studied this longevity yet, but let's sort them. Make 3 columns in your notebook. Known, partially known, unknown. Well, it's actually a critical thinking task. Do I know it or don't I? Then you can say, well, what does know it mean to you? And explain the complexities of knowing. You can take the same list maybe halfway through the unit and say, sort it by syllable stress. So I like to do this standing up. I'm a big believer in kinesthetics. Big paper on the wall and a couple of students, 2 or 3 students. So they're trying out different pronunciations. Is it confidence, confidence, confidence? And there's stress patterns, and they're saying, and they're spelling each word, sometimes incorrectly. They're going around fixing it. And they're getting this phonological awareness of the word. Auditory memory is very important. For a long time, in Mexico, there was a kind of shopping place, and I kept calling it murciélago. Murciélago in Spanish means bat. But the name of the place was Luciérnaga. Can you hear? Murciélago. So somehow in my memory, that was the stress pattern. And I don't think I'm the only one. Maybe I'm the weird one, but audio and memory is very important. And then they also noticed that multi-word units have a primary stress. So in actual fact is the second syllable stress. And they begin looking at these multi-word units as word-like objects. Then you can step back and do some choral repetition and maybe find some patterns. I don't see it here, but a common one I see is T-I-O-N. And I say, okay, do you see a pattern in the stress? And finally they'll say, oh, it's the second to the last syllable. So that also helps them. Another quick activity you can do is, this is for yourself, but I also give it to students, recategorize the list. Take another look at that list and say, what do I have in terms of academic words, multi-word units, subject-specific words, so I've got encountered, odds, radically, and you can easily find that out on Google. Just say the academic word list highlighter, and you can find out which ones are actually on the list. And then lexical phrases, do's and don'ts. We can't do don'ts and do's, right? So that's kind of interesting. and delexicalized verbs. I could put that as part of phrasal verbs, but I recognize put. Oh, okay. So, and then I could say to myself, maybe I'll focus on one of these groups of words this week. It just gives you another way to look. Or maybe I'll focus on a collocation pattern, like adjective noun. And I might send them to the text of the listening and say, find all the adjective noun combinations. It's really interesting. If you're a Spanish speaker, this is news to you. Right? Remember hospital animal. You're seeing it doesn't work that way usually in English. So these are short things you can do, and I'm sure you do many other things as you're teaching through the unit. Short, frequent activities for retrieval. Now, occasionally you need to do, excuse me, longer activities for using and creating. I put use, create because Nation actually changed his vocabulary, which I like create better. So fluency line is really good. So I always like this standing up again. One student is going to defend longevity myths. All right, he or she has a list of do's and don'ts. You have to restrict your calories. You have to go to the gym every day. You have to do those brain games, and you can't work too hard. And maybe you take Prevagen. I've been seeing that lately. And then the other person says, no, you're all wrong. And the longevity project says, do that. So what I would do here is say, go to that list and pick out 3 words that you want to use. And the choice is important. I find it very hard to be forced to use words. So pick the ones you want to learn. And now we'll talk 1 minute here, 1 minute here, and you use your words. And they really do use their words. Of course, you also want to apply to writing and look at their output. One student wrote, the topic here was, if you could live very long life. And she said, today, April 17th, 2175 is my birthday. I am 184, which is a quarter of the average in the golden age. In this golden age, everything is different. Humans celebrate their birthday with a new feeling. It's a mix of longevity, accomplishment, happiness, and satisfaction, which human beings have never felt before. The golden age started in 2020. Oh, it's coming soon. Which means humans saw huge change happen in the world system. So this is a paragraph of a very nice essay at a high intermediate level. It's been worked on for grammar, but we could also take a look at vocabulary. And what jumped out at me, of course, was what I call the people problem. She used humans, but so what can we do? We want to vary the vocabulary, change it, use pronouns, maybe eliminate it. But we also maybe want to upgrade. What can we get from our she's using some of the words like accomplishment, longevity, etc., but maybe she can use others. So it's a good question to ask, how to vary and upgrade your vocabulary. So that's the first practice, this defining the target words and thinking of supplementing your textbook to do many short activities as you go along. The second is teaching strategies. And the point here is to teach a few really essential word learning strategies. What do you do when you hit a word you don't know? Ignore it? That's not bad. It's not a bad strategy. Infer. Lexical inferencing. What could it mean? Investigate. Whoop, go to the phone. Odell says learner training is actually one of the most useful things you can do during the vocabulary component of your language course. So students, what I notice among students, and I think it's among all of us, is that we regress. When we're doing a second language or another language, we regress to word by word, kind of simplistic kind of thinking. So we need that awareness to build up those skills that we already have in our first language, or we learned so long ago we don't have the metacognition for. So what are they? The old inferring from context. this example is taken from the New York Times. I was reading about the Saudi prince, and he said, a chateau developer bulldozed a 19th century castle to make way for a new castle in 2009. Anybody read this article? Yes. So I thought, there's a common error I've seen in doing lexical inferencing, which is look at all those words that they probably don't know. Chateau, developer, make way for. It's too hard. Nation says they need to know 95 to 98% of the context in order to make a reasonable inference. It's not easy to make an inference. Try it in your second language. It's not easy. So I really recommend pedagogically created sentences, such as in 2009, the builder bulldozed a 19th century castle to clear the land for a new castle. Well, you might say, Francis, bulldoze. That's kind of a weird word. But it so happens that that was the entire meaning of this article, that they actually razed, R-A-Z-E-D, razed a castle. So bulldozed is an important word to understand that text. So at any list of strategies, inferring from context has to come at the top. Here's a sentence from Marianne Robinson's novel, Gilead. This surprised me a good deal at the time, more at the time than it does in retrospect. So you could look around the sentence, the word, retrospect, in the sentence, and you see that, okay, at the time, it seems to be more than, there seems to be a comparison. We can get that from the context. And then you could look inside the word, and there's retro and spect. Maybe we could get retro. Some students know it from fashion. And spect, if you suggest spectacles or spectacular, they might get look back. But it's not a slam dunk. It's hard. It's hard to do it. So number one is the context, usually the sentence. So I have some students say, well, Francis, why bother? This is so much work. Well, yes, it is work. It's a critical thinking, deeper processing kind of thing. But of course, if you do the work, it sticks much better in your memory. And it increases your reading fluency in the long term. This inconvenience that requires effort is actually what learning is about. But we have to convince them, I think, sometimes. Now, you might think I'm retrograde, but I am a big believer in the vocabulary notebook. Brittany tells me our students don't want to have a notebook. Well, I said, I'm sorry. Your personalized learning device. Okay, you need to record incidental vocabulary in the class, collocation charts and different things we have on the board. It's visual. And record the sorting exercises like we did the known, unknown, partially known, questions that you have. And Nation says that the way you record a word has a strong effect on how you learn the word. If you thought that was bad, word cards. Seriously. These belong to my colleague Megan, who's here, and she's learning Spanish. So she has on one side newspaper and the other side periódico. Now that's a great way to start. Simple. Word on the front, definition on the back. But as you build up your knowledge of that word, you could add maybe some cognates, Megan. Periodical. Periodical. Period of time, right? Oh, I'm connecting. Right? And then maybe a collocation or a sentence or something. So I say to the students, review every day, 10, 15 minutes over your coffee or tea, on the bus, on the subway, and then, very importantly, shuffle. Oh my gosh, right? You got to keep that brain working. So why word cards? They're effective. Paul Nation says there's 100 years of research on this very low-tech strategy. They're individualized. They can take the teacher selected, the student selected, the things from incidental vocabulary. They're kinesthetic. You can count them, you can touch them, you can cast them aside, you can add new ones. They're flexible. right? You could say into the class, sort them by syllable stress. Whoop, right, take them off the ring. They can quiz each other. And I think they're fun for our high-touch deprived students. I really do. I mean, Quizlet is fine, but word cards, you know, I used to just suggest them. But now I don't pussyfoot around. They're required. And I really do think they like them and they work. This is my experiment anyway. Digital reference works are also very important. As you can see, I don't have digital ones, but they are great online dictionaries now. Merriam-Webster, where Corey Stamper works, is great. The Longman, the CoBuild, and concordancers, where you can just look up how the word is used in context. But you have to get them to the quality reference works. The internet is awash in this stuff, and there's some bad stuff. So show them the quality ones, and then you have to teach them how to use the dictionary. One of the biggest things is which meaning. How do you choose which meaning? And there are hardly any books that ever show you that. So those are the tools for students. The third practice is create teachable moments. And the point here in teachable moments is to model the word knowledge pattern, the form, meaning, usage in the class, to introduce incidental vocabulary mindfully, and to raise word consciousness. So here we are, modeling word knowledge, form, meaning, and. So the student says, what does discrete mean? Or maybe, what means discrete? And you say, well, quiet, not obvious in speaking or acting. What are the word forms? Right? Discretion, be discreet, discreet, discreetly. Collocations, go or move discreetly, speak discreetly. Sentence, when her boyfriend called, she went discreetly into her room. Or this morning, of course, my consciousness is up, I read that there's a new executive rehab facility which is a discrete environment for wealthy opioid addicts who are recovering, a discrete environment. So, and then the homonym, discrete from mathematics, a discrete or separate, D-I-S-C-R-E-T-E. That's interesting for them. Then write it down in your vocabulary notebook. And I find this semester, getting some of the greatest questions. The other day, a student said, what's the difference between oppress and suppress? Well, you have to stay on your toes for that stuff. Which is great, because I'm a word lover. And they're thinking. P.S. Defining is a pedagogical skill and a professional skill. Stamper, a professional at this, likens it to a free throw in basketball or hitting the nail on the head. It's that one motion that you keep trying for. That sounds a little bit masculine to me, and maybe for some of us it's that pinch of salt exactly in the soup. Whatever it is, you want to be able to get it. Simple and student-friendly. So when the student says, what does conspicuous mean, you try to avoid saying, describe something that you notice right away because it stands out. And you stick with easily seen. In the classroom, bring up incidental vocabulary. This is a professional skill. Of course, we do this all the time, but really be mindful what you're bringing up. It's great for idioms, right? The context of the classroom just begs for us to name them. You were under the weather. Now you're on the mend. I'm so glad. What happens to me these days, I lost my train of thought. Right? And it also works well to upgrade the level or the register. And the other day we were having a discussion about violence in a movie I had shown them. Oh, okay. And they really were talking about, well, the violence wasn't just thrown in there, but it was very helpful for me to give them gratuitous violence. And it raised the level of the discussion because they had the right words. And this made me think of Bauthier-Laufer's active vocabulary threshold hypothesis. Bauthier-Laufer is a professor at the University of Haifa, and she's done a lot of work with Paul Nation. And her idea is that basically a rising tide lifts all boats. So if you require them, if you're throughout our lives, we learn vocabulary, passive vocabulary. But we only rise to the level of active vocabulary that the environment requires. So in our classrooms, we have to require a higher level for them to rise up. Finally, develop word consciousness. This is a certain type of questioning, line of questioning. This is from Siri Hufstede, who's a wonderful writer, came from Minnesota to New York a number of years ago. And she says, more than 20 years ago, I saw a man sprawled on the sidewalk at Broadway and 105th Street, unshaven, filthy, and ragged. He lay on his side in an apparent stupor, clutching a bottle in a torn and wrinkled paper bag. So sprawled, what is sprawled? What other words could Siri Hufstede have used? Lying there, resting there, ask them. Spread out there, stretched out there. Why did she choose sprawled? What is it about the word sprawled? It's a very powerful word. It's an image in your mind, right? And how about clutching? What could she have used? Well, holding, grasping. All right, but what about clutching? There's a kind of desperation in it. So you raise their consciousness. And a consummate stylist, like John Steinbeck, describes returning to California, his home, after many, many years. And he says, I knew that strip angled against the Pacific better than any place in the world. Well, John Steinbeck is no neophyte slinger of polysyllabic Latinate diction. These are really tiny little words, but look at them. The strip. What does he mean? Well, it's like a piece of land. But when you look at California, right, angled, oh my gosh, it's just incredible, you know. So you get them to get excited about word choice and the power of words and appreciate why certain words are used and what makes great writing. Last practice is really the point is to reinforce and expand word learning strategies through peer sharing and promote reading as a means of vocabulary development. So this is my newest idea for vocabulary groups. It's a weekly discussion, kind of a vocabulary support group, if you will, with rotating roles. You might do it for 3 weeks. You might do it for 6 weeks. I wouldn't do it all semester unless they really love it. But with rotating roles. So outside of class, you hope your students are doing the word work, learner and doing as autonomous learners. But in class, they collaborate and motivate each other. So they report and comment. One reports, one comments, one evaluates the word learning process that week. They expand their repertoire of strategies. This is really key. Most students have strategies, but they always use the same ones. And they can learn some really good ones from other students. And they enjoy it. It sharpens their metacognition. For you, the teacher, you're quality control. So you're listening in and you encourage students to choose words from listening and reading texts. Forget those boxes of GRE words. They're weird. Choose from the appropriate level of texts. Stop reading The Economist. This is the Harvard Business Review. I mean, yes, that's aspirational, but it's not going to help you way beyond the level. Use English synonyms. I had one student with tons of cards and everything was in Chinese. I said, that's okay to start, but add the English. Now he's happy camper, adding the English. So then you collect also and share some of the strategies that you have observed in the whole class. And I'll be giving you the sheets that I have them fill out, and you're perfectly welcome to make them much better and fit your students if you like this idea. Some of the results are really pretty funny. The students are very creative. As you can see, this is Bianca's Post-it all over her apartment. Then there was Vince's midnight word card review. And Harry's pronunciation coach is Siri on his smartphone. And my favorite of all was a student I had named Evan, who said, you know, Frances, the best place to find words is Black Friday on Amazon, the day after Black Friday, when people are mad He said, don't look at the 1-star reviews. Those are rude. But the 2-star reviews have great, so, wherever they can find it. Very creative, right? To support this work, you can give individualized quizzes. These don't take so long. So you have them give you their list of words that they've chosen, the student-selected words, and then just say, give me a definition, a synonym, a sentence, or a collocation. Also, reading. Books are where the words are. The readers have the highest vocabularies. Toni Morrison says, reading is sustained surrender to the company of my own mind while it touches another. And it's that sustained surrender that is invaluable for language teaching. Listening is invaluable too, listening while you read. The audible.com and other resources are terrific. But your job is really to help them choose lots of enjoyable books. It's not so easy when you're talking about lower levels. So language learner literature is very important here. It eliminates the infrequent words and it keeps recycling the frequent words in different contexts. So you have the Oxford Bookworm series, you have the Penguin Readers, and Paul Nation is actually homemaking with an app, his own books, which you can find for free on his website, kind of classics in British literature, but also others like the Metamorphosis and some others. And maybe if you're interested in this, you can do your own. I don't know, it seems possible. So to sum up, the 4 good practices I'm saying are interactive and ongoing. Like error correction, they're kind of always with you at some level, part of your pedagogical practice. It's kind of a vocabulary mini-syllabus going along as you're teaching everything else you have to teach. Now, I tried to make an acronym, MATS, TAMS, STAM, and I failed. But target words are the teacher-selected words. The teacher tools, sort of, the teachable moments that you create in your class. The student-selected words are the learner autonomy, and then the student tools are the strategies. So overall, my advice is to be ambitious and be patient. Now, I'd just like to end with a little inspiration. And this is sharing my word-watching hobby, sort of a collector's kind of hobby. It's a sample of a mini lecture I might give to students. I do give to students. And it could be done all at once or in small segments. And it's a non-specialist view of the language. But it does usually pique their interest and shows my ongoing interest for sure. And this word-watching vocabulary is from Claire Cramsh. And she says it transforms vocabulary learning into a collector's hobby. And it teaches students to be conscious of the areas in which they're deficient, to make choices and to test those choices. So a few fun facts about English. Mark Twain said the difference between a near-perfect word and a perfect word is like the difference between a bolt of lightning and a lightning bug. How many words are there in English? Bill Bryson, the popular writer, says it retains probably the richest vocabulary, the most diverse shading of meanings of any language. And I've seen many different estimates. He offers about 500,000. But if you include technical words, it gets much bigger. But it's big. It's probably the only language with that thesaurus. Synonyms. My gosh, this is just some of them for the word big. The difference between large and great, this is what corpus linguistics shows us. Large is kind of that physical size, whereas great is more about impressiveness. It's interesting. Homonyms. We had discrete, that's fun. Acronyms. You probably already know SCUBA, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. It's fun. Where do they all come from? In English, words are continually created, changed, adopted. Shakespeare invented or maybe wrote down for the first time 10% people think about of his vocabulary. Look at these words, zany, leapfrog, gloomy. Like, it's amazing they come from that long ago. I love to watch words, and the word I've been watching for a long time is blog. Blog is a portmanteau, right, of the web, B of web, and the log of blog. So it combines the form and the meaning. And then we get blog is the thing, blogger is the person, and blog is the verb. How about the world of blogs and bloggers? Blogosphere. I tried to fit that into the crossword puzzle this morning and it was wrong. Okay, those who love this world. Blogophiles, those who loathe this world. Now, who can guess the disease of blogging too much? Bloggeria. Yeah. Then we change words, add prefixes, suffixes, do compounds. Right? We have boathouse and houseboat. Kind of fun. The prefix micro we can put in front of scope, organism, phone, processor. We can play a game. What do you call a place that produces small quantities of beer in a traditional way? Very useful word. Loans given to local people to fight poverty. Adopting words. H.L. Mencken, that incredible, irascible journalist of the 20s, wrote, "A living language is like a man suffering incessantly from small hemorrhages. And what it needs above all else is constant transfusions of new blood from other tongues. The day the gates go up, that day it begins to die." Great metaphor, right? 50% of our words are non-Anglo-Saxon. Caucus comes from Algonquin, American Indian. How interesting. From Arabic, algebra, algorithm, almanac. Oh, notice they all begin with al. Chinese, feng shui, gung ho, kowtow. French, amateur, bon voyage, ballet. German, schadenfreude. I don't know if I should use a capital in English. That's zeitgeist. And Italian, bankrupt, bancarotta. So I try to get the words from languages my students speak. Karaoke, taekwondo, intelligentsia, bravo, enchilada, macho salsa, and yogurt. Now here's one of my new categories. Words that English needs, perhaps. Razliubit. Is that right, Allah? And then Swedish, second refill of coffee. How about this? Kabelsalat, for that bunch of cords behind your TV or under your workstation. Right? Isn't that great? And then this one I love, Verwendungsglädje, which is the joy of anticipation, but it's just one word. And then Christopher came up with wabi-sabi, in Japanese, appreciating imperfection and decay. So they're loaded with culture. Isn't that great? And we have two sets of words. Accompany in Latin. Go with. Prepare. Remove. Get rid of. Continue. Put up with, in Anglo-Saxon. Or tolerate. So why? Why do we have two sets of words? The hint is 1066. Okay, the French invaded English. And William the Conqueror was in his 40s. Do you think he became the first ESL student? No way. He said, you're going to speak my language. So we got a pyramid, a social and linguistic hierarchy. On the top was Latin, still Latin, religion, the language of learning and religion. French was the language of social and cultural prestige. And all the rest, the plebe, vulgar base common people, spoke English, continued to speak English. And we were unregulated, and we were troublesome, the dissenters. So our language flourished. And of course, we keep French still for all the prestigious things. So mixed diction is the flavor of English, when you have these long, incomparable zip, right? Latin and Anglo-Saxon. Inconsequential slip, epistemological spat, meteorological blip, epically unfit. I won't explain who that is. And so I end with this picture. English is high-flown, a combination of high-flown and down-home. And they enjoy it. So I'll leave you with this thought, that vocabulary learning is really only one sub-goal of a range of goals that are important in our language classroom. But as we've seen, expanding vocabulary is a big task. Expanding your knowledge and your lexicon is a big task. So as teachers, we must enlist the learners and do everything we can to keep them on board through the trip. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Frances, for your wonderful plenary. We do have time to take a few questions, so if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will try to distribute the microphone. I saw this one first.
Thank you. Thank you for that great talk. I don't know if you could just quickly mention what you do with those weekly support groups, because that looked intriguing.
Yes, so we spend about 30 minutes, and they're in a group of 3. One is the reporter, one's the commentator, and one's the evaluator. And I just have them, the reporter reports. And the list of things, as you'll see in the handout that's coming around, is really just reviewing where you could notice words. And so it asks a series of questions, and they answer them. Well, I've noticed something on the billboard, or I've heard something on the radio, or I saw this in a newspaper. One thing I didn't say that I love about this activity is that some of the dark horses, the people that don't talk that much or don't feel so confident, are sometimes really great at word collecting. And I had one of those kinds of students teach another really loudmouth student the word upshot. And it was great. The upshot was a lot of good learning. So they just go through these sheets, and then sometimes I might do a little lesson on related things, but it's really a way to have a kind of discussion.
And they're each bringing their own vocabulary.
Yes, yeah. Oh, you're choosing the questions.
I have the mic.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Hi.
So I was struck when you used the examples with the verbs, the passage with the verbs to sprawl and to clutch, and I've wondered if English has more verbs than other languages.
I have no idea. That's an interesting question. We do have more vocabulary. So in that sense, yes. But if we use them, if we were to count the verbs in the corpus, I don't know. But we do have more vocabulary. It's true. I'm sorry?
We verbalize all the time. We create verbs out of
And we create, yeah. So in that sense, we do. Yeah. Yeah, when you're doing guessing from context, really stick to verbs and nouns. The adjectives are really hard.
I had a question about the flashcards. So I had read that flashcards were good for short-term memory, but for the long-term, that they don't end up working as well. But in yours, you said like kind of the opposite. So what has your experience been with using the word cards?
Well, as I said, spaced retrieval, remember that chart? So most of our students, well, they're not maybe younger than you, but they're way younger than me. And they can learn the words, but they need to review them. So the next week, review them with space in between. And the next week. So it works very well if you review over time. And I didn't mention this, but I give cumulative quizzes to encourage them, not so much to grade them, but to encourage them. So let's take the first 3 sets of words, restudy them, and I'll give you a little quiz. That's important for motivation and memory. Okay?
Any more questions? Yes.
Which dictionaries do you like?
I like the Merriam-Webster online is terrific. Some of my students love the Longman and the co-build. You know, I think those are the 3 top ones in my book.
Do they use them online or do they
Yes.
have their books?
You know, I love paper, but hey, I'm a different generation. I think the online resources are just terrific, and they're getting better all the time.
Yes, I'm just
think
wondering
she's in
how
charge of
you
this.
encourage students to use this new vocabulary that they're working on in their writing. Do you require a certain amount? Or?
Well, I do it through editing. So first you plan what you're going to write, then you write it, and then you revise and edit it. And in that editing phase, I encourage them to get out their lists of words of the unit they've been studying and see if they can use any of them. But I also do it when I'm correcting their giving them feedback, saying, think of another word, or we had another word. And then sometimes I bring it into class, as I did here, and say, circle a couple of words you think you could maybe upgrade. So it's a constant prodding. But, you know, I had a student who fell in love with the word crux. The crux of the matter. I mean, it's a great word, but he always used it in every essay. And I said, Leo, you know, it's a great word, but vary it, you know. So it's ongoing. And I don't like to say you must use X word, because I mean, if somebody said that to me, I would just think, oh, it's an exercise, you know. Yeah. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to make a comment about the digital dictionary.
Mm-hmm.
On the phones, all the dictionaries, Merriam-Webster, have the recent feature, which creates like automatic flashcards. These words that they've looked up recently, all there in a list.
Okay, so the feature, there's a recent feature that shows what they've been looking up. And that's an advantage of an online dictionary. I'm not opposed to these online Quizlet. I think they're great. But there's something about the touch that is also wonderful. And so I make a joke about it. I said, you know, this is 100 years of research, blah, blah, blah. But it's working, I think.
Okay. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering because like I'm teaching Indonesian and sometimes like my students has difficulty in differentiating like noun, verb, all those kind of like part of speech.
Parts of
What is
speech.
your what is your suggestion?
Yes, I don't often teach at that level where they have that trouble, so maybe I don't have the best answer. But I think I would do it probably through some simple thing like a story, and then you take out the words and you regroup them. You know, just like we made a list, I start with alphabetical, then maybe you could regroup them into noun, verb. I don't have a really great answer for it, but practice. You know, the principle of time on task. The more you do it, the better you get, and I think that's what it takes. And you also have to point out that in English you have words like water that can be a noun and a verb, and that's complicated. But if it's very basic level, I think I'd use story, a simple context, and then.
Like when you introduce vocabulary, you tell them the verb.
Yes, you could classify them. There are many ways to classify. That would be a perfectly fine one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.
Any other questions? Okay.
So I just like to say that I'm sure you're going to learn much more in the upcoming presentations, and just indulge that inner word lover, because it's one of the great joys of our profession. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you, my dear. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Francis. That was awesome, and I think everyone here learned a lot and enjoyed. We will be starting our second session in about 20 minutes. So you have some time to
Snack
mingle, get a second breakfast or a first breakfast. And this is room A, and the room next door is room B.
Wow, look at these. Was it?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
I was like, oh my God, Carol, she's doing so